Do you believe a single man can defy fate to the point of changing the course of history, yet remain more legend than flesh and blood? For centuries, the name Viking struck terror, a byword for barbarism and destruction. But what if I told you that behind this bloody reputation, there's a figure who, though shrouded in myth, personified the ambition, cunning, and courage of an entire era? Prepare to question everything you thought you knew about the Middle Ages, because today, we're unveiling the saga of Ragnar Lothbrok, the most legendary Viking of all time. No other name resonates as powerfully when we speak of the raiders from the north, and Ragnar's story is a wake-up call to complacency. He wasn't just a warrior, he was a strategist, the father of a lineage of conquerors and a man who refused to accept limits. His promise that his sons would avenge him against the snakes wasn't just a final cry, but a guarantee that his legacy would never die. And the best part? You don't have to wait to find out what happens next. If this introduction has your adrenaline pumping, get ready, because the journey will be epic. Go ahead and like this video to show your support, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any of the legends we'll uncover, and hit that notification bell to be the first to embark on our next adventures. Your help is essential for us to spread knowledge about these fascinating chapters of history. And to connect even more, tell us in the comments where in the world you're watching this unforgettable saga. In the northern reaches of Europe, where deep fjords kissed gray skies and dense forests whispered ancient secrets, lay Scandinavia, a land shaped by ice and fire. Before the keels of longships cut through the waters of distant realms, before the name Viking became a cry of terror and awe, Norse societies lived by a rhythm dictated by unforgiving nature and the cycles of the seasons. They were communities of farmers, fishermen, and by necessity artisans, who cultivated the stony land with simple tools and drew their sustenance from a sea that was both a source of life and an almost impassable barrier. Life was arduous, depending on modest harvests of barley and rye, hunting in the forests, and fishing in icy waters. Life was communal, centered in small villages and isolated farms, where family and clan were the fundamental units of social organization and protection. The importance of agriculture and the sea was intrinsic to their existence. Fertile lands were scarce, and population density, though low by modern standards, began to strain available resources. The sea, on the other hand, was a vast and mysterious frontier, both an invitation and a challenge. The Norse were no strangers to its waters. Their navigation and shipbuilding skills, though still developing, already surpassed those of many of their neighbors. Small coastal vessels allowed for local trade and fishing, but the horizons beyond the mist remained largely unexplored. Religious and social life was deeply intertwined. Pagan rituals, sacrifices, and celebrations marked the calendar, honoring gods and goddesses from the Norse pantheon who governed aspects of nature and human existence. The worship of deities like Odin, the All-Father, god of wisdom, war, and poetry; Thor, the mighty protector of men and god of thunder; and Freya, the goddess of love, fertility, and war, was central to their identity and social cohesion. These rituals, often performed in sacred clearings or wooden temples, reinforced the Norse people's connection to the cosmos and ensured divine blessing for their harvests, their journeys, and their battles. The environment that forged these future Norse warriors was a cauldron of adversity. Long, harsh winters tested their resilience, and the constant need for self-defense against raids from rival clans or wild animals cultivated a culture of self-sufficiency and bravery. The art of war, though on a smaller scale than it would become, was already an intrinsic part of their lives. Young boys were trained from an early age in handling axes, spears, and shields, not just for battle, but as essential tools for hunting and protection. Honor was a supreme value, and shame, a curse. It was a world where physical strength, cunning, and loyalty were highly valued qualities, and death in combat, a glorious path to the halls of Valhalla. In this setting, far from the riches and organization of the Christian civilizations to the south, Scandinavia was a land of contrasts, wild beauty and brutal challenges, deep spirituality, and a pragmatic acceptance of violence. It was an environment that, unbeknownst to itself, was incubating a force that would soon erupt beyond its fjords. carrying with it the name of an era and the seed of legends that would echo for millennia. The quietude of these deep winters and the whisper of cold winds over vast forests were, in truth, the silent prelude to a storm that would change the face of Europe. At the heart of Norse society, mythology wasn't merely a collection of stories. It was the very fiber that wove together the reality, morality, and aspirations of every individual. A Viking's life was intrinsically shaped by the rich tapestry of myths and legends that explained the universe, the origin of life, the destiny of men, and the glory of death. From birth, Norse children were immersed in the sagas of the Aesir and Vanir, of ice and fire giants, of the 9 worlds interconnected by the cosmic tree Yggdrasil. They grew up hearing tales of Odin, the All-Father, who sacrificed an eye for wisdom and journeyed through realms seeking knowledge and power. His quests inspired an incessant pursuit of glory and understanding. They learned about Thor, the protector of Midgard, whose hammer Mjolnir crushed enemies, and whose brutal yet just strength resonated with the need to defend family and community. Every thunderclap in the sky was a reminder of his imposing presence. Freya, the goddess of war and love, taught that beauty and ferocity could coexist, and that the Valkyries, her handmaidens, chose the bravest for eternal glory. The quest for Valhalla wasn't a distant fantasy, but a palpable motivation for warriors. For a Viking, dying in battle wasn't a tragic end, but an honorable passage to the Hall of the Chosen, where they would join Odin in daily feasts and training, preparing for Ragnarok, the end of times. This belief instilled an almost insane courage in combat, transforming the fear of death into a burning desire for immortality through glory. A warrior who fell with a weapon in hand guaranteed their place among heroes, and the stain of dying of old age or illness, without honor, was viewed with disdain. Honor in battle, therefore, wasn't just an ideal. It was the currency for the afterlife, the guarantee of a legacy that would echo in the songs of the skalds for generations. Fate, or weird, was another fundamental concept permeating the Viking mindset. It was believed that each man's destiny was predetermined by the Norns, weavers of time, and that, although individuals could influence the path, the final destiny was immutable. This, counterintuitively, didn't lead to passivity, but to a fatalistic acceptance of life and death. If your destiny was to die in battle, so be it, but let it be with bravery and honor, so that death served a greater purpose. This belief allowed for extraordinary audacity, a detachment in the face of danger that terrified their enemies. Sacrificial rituals, seasonal festivities, and epic narratives recited around bonfires served to keep this connection with the divine and ancestral world alive. The names of the gods were invoked before battles, during planting, and in the construction of a new longship. The land and sea themselves were seen as manifestations of divine power. Tales of past heroes, of legendary kings and jarls who had achieved great feats through their courage and cunning, served as models to be emulated. Ragnar Lothbrok, even before becoming a legend, grew up immersed in this universe, where the line between the real and the mythical was thin, and where the aspiration of an ordinary man was to transcend mortality, engraving his name in sagas that would be sung for centuries. Norse mythology, therefore, wasn't just a backdrop for the Viking Age. It was its soul, the engine that propelled men to face the unknown, to seek glory, and to shape a world in the image of their gods and heroes. While the Scandinavian tribes clung to their traditions and myths, a gradual, yet inexorable transformation began to manifest in the mists of the north. The Viking Age, with its reputation for raids and conquests, didn't erupt suddenly like thunder from a clear sky. It was the culmination of centuries of development, internal pressures, and an insatiable curiosity that pushed these peoples beyond their familiar fjords. The first signs of Viking expansion weren't the great fleets that plundered cities like Paris or London, but rather sporadic and isolated incursions, almost like probes, small boats exploring nearby coasts, audacious traders seeking new routes, and occasionally, impatient warriors seeking honor and plunder. These early voyages were, for the most part, smaller-scale expeditions, focused on unprotected targets or small coastal settlements. One of the crucial factors for this rise was the continuous improvement in navigation technology. The Norse peoples, already skilled boat builders, began to refine the design of their vessels. The early longships weren't the optimized warships they would become, but they were capable of facing the turbulent waters of the North Sea and the Baltic, with impressive stability and speed for the time. Their shallower keel allowed them to navigate in shallow waters and ascend rivers, which would be an invaluable strategic advantage in their future incursions. The use of sails, in conjunction with oars, provided both speed and autonomy, transforming the sea from a barrier into an avenue to the unknown. The search for fertile lands and riches acted as a powerful catalyst. Scandinavia, though rich in timber and ore, had limited capacity for agriculture. Gradual increase in population meant less land available per family and more mouths to feed. Sagas frequently mention young warriors who, lacking significant land inheritance, saw plunder and conquest as their only chance to ascend socially and secure a future for themselves and their descendants. Wealth wasn't just gold and silver. It also included slaves, luxury goods, furs, textiles, and, crucially, new lands to settle. The sight of rich, seemingly carefree settlements in the British Isles and continental Europe, filled with churches and monasteries that stored treasures without significant defenses, became an irresistible invitation. This prelude to an era of incursions wasn't just about plunder. There was also a strong component of exploration and trade. Vikings weren't just warriors, but also shrewd traders, establishing routes that stretched from the Baltic to Russia, the Byzantine Empire, and the North Atlantic. Their voyages brought not only wealth, but also knowledge, new techniques, and an expansion of their own worldview. They learned about the cultures, defenses, and weaknesses of their neighbors, turning each raid into a lesson for the next. The famous attack on the monastery of Lindisfarne in 793 AD is often cited as the starting point of the Viking Age. Although it wasn't the very first raid, it was a shock of such magnitude that it echoed throughout Christendom, warning of the arrival of a new force from the north. This event, symbolic of their ferocity and disregard for sanctuaries, marked the beginning of an era of terror and transformation. Thus, the rise of the Viking Age was a complex mosaic of environmental, technological, economic, and cultural factors. It was the preparation for a perfect storm where necessity met opportunity, and the ability to innovate in warfare and navigation allowed a people once marginalized to shape the destiny of a continent. The stage was being set for figures like Ragnar Lothbrok, men who would not only answer this call, but would personify it and elevate it to legendary status. The figure of Ragnar Lothbrok emerges from the mists of history and saga, a tangle of grand deeds and mythical origins, where the line between man and legend is thin and, at times, indistinguishable. Unlike many monarchs and warlords whose lives are meticulously recorded in annals and chronicles, Ragnar is, in large part, a product of Norse sagas, especially the saga of Ragnar Lothbrok and Saxo Grammaticus's Gesta Danorum, written centuries after the events they supposedly narrate. These sources, full of fantastic and heroic elements, shape the image of a charismatic, cunning, and incomparable warrior, whose lineage and exploits intertwined with the very fabric of Norse mythology. The few and controversial sources about his birth and youth do not offer a clear biographical account in the modern sense. Instead, they focus on deeds that established his reputation early on. One of the most prominent, and certainly the most colorful, narratives involves his first wife, Kraka, later identified as the legendary Lagertha. The saga tells that Ragnar, still young and seeking to prove his worth, was called to help Jarl Siward of Gotaland, whose daughter was being threatened by a bear and a giant serpent. Many warriors retreated, but Ragnar, fearless, confronted and defeated the beasts, wearing an outfit of wolf and bear skin, which earned him the nickname Lothbrok, hairy breeches or shaggy breeches, a reference to his attire. It was in this episode that he met Lagertha, a formidable shield maiden who fought bravely alongside the men. Impressed by her courage and beauty, Ragnar courted her. However, Lagertha, cunning and independent, set a test. She tricked him with a bear and a hunting dog in her home, which Ragnar had to defeat with his spear. This union with a free-spirited warrior, who ruled her own territory and fought as an equal with men, established a precedent for the kind of leader Ragnar would be, someone who recognized value and strength, regardless of conventions. This initial narrative serves as a founding event of his legend, showing that Ragnar was not just a man, but a hero destined for great deeds, whose conquests were predicted by his ability to face supernatural challenges from a young age. Besides Lagertha, the sagas mention other wives such as Thora Borgarhjört, from whom he would have to rescue her castle from a giant serpent, and Aslaug, Kraka, daughter of the legendary hero Sigurd and the Valkyrie Brynhildr, which would grant Ragnar an even nobler and more mythical lineage, connecting him directly to the gods and heroes of the past. These stories, though lacking strict historical validation, are crucial for understanding how Ragnar was perceived by his own people and by future generations. They are not just entertainment. They are the genealogy of a hero, the justification of his greatness, and the prelude to his future conquests. Ragnar's legendary origin, therefore, is more than a simple birth record. It's the construction of an archetype. He is not born a king, but forges his path through trials of courage and cunning that echo the deeds of the gods. It's the story of a man who, even before embarking on his great raids, was already destined to fill the pages of sagas and become the prototype of the great Viking leader, the conqueror who dared to defy the unknown and face the greatest dangers to achieve eternal glory. This mythical foundation of his life is what elevates him from mere mortal to an immortal figure in popular imagination. Scandinavia in the Viking Age wasn't a unified kingdom, but a fragmented mosaic of small realms, jarls, chieftains or earls, and semi-independent clans constantly engaged in a complex dance of alliances, rivalries, and intermittent wars. Far from the hierarchical structure of southern empires, power was diffuse and frequently contested. Each jarl ruled their own land, collected taxes, commanded their own warriors, and made decisions that directly impacted the lives of their people. Loyalty was often personal, tied to the leader's strength and charisma, rather than to a crown or a centralized state. This political fluidity was both a challenge and an opportunity for ambitious men. In this scenario, the constant struggle for power and influence was the norm. Arranged marriages cemented temporary alliances, but the slightest provocation or the perception of a neighbor's weakness could lead to incursions, raids, and attempts at annexation. Honor and revenge were powerful motives, and an offense to one clan could lead to cycles of retaliation that lasted generations. Military strength was the ultimate arbiter of any dispute, and the ability to lead warriors in combat was the primary quality for ascending the social and political hierarchy. A successful jarl not only defended their lands but also expanded them, gaining wealth and prestige through conquest. The absence of a strong central authority meant that competition among leaders was fierce. This decentralization, paradoxically, was one of the engines of Viking expansion. When land became scarce or opportunities for internal advancement limited, the natural solution was to seek wealth and power overseas. Viking expeditions, therefore, weren't just about plunder. They were also a form of pressure release valve for internal tensions, channeling warrior energy out of Scandinavia and temporarily uniting rival factions under a common leader in pursuit of an external objective. It was in this cauldron of internal conflicts and ambition that Ragnar Lothbrok distinguished himself. He didn't inherit a great kingdom, but built his authority and his legend from his own capabilities. Sagas portray him as a man who knew how to navigate this complex web of relationships. His military cunning and his ability to lead successful expeditions earned him fame and followers. He was able to attract warriors from different jarls and even from other realms, not by birthright, but by his reputation for bringing plunder and glory. The promise of a share in the spoils, of adventures in distant lands, and, above all, the chance to fight alongside a legendary leader was an irresistible draw for ambitious young men. Ragnar knew how to exploit the power dynamics of his time. He forged strategic alliances, used his strength to intimidate rivals, and his cunning to overcome obstacles that others would consider insurmountable. His ability to inspire loyalty wasn't based on a throne, but on his hamingja, his innate luck and charisma, which made him seem favored by the gods. Thus, in the fragmented and volatile political landscape of Scandinavia, Ragnar Lothbrok wasn't just another jarl. He was a catalyst, a man who knew how to transform internal competition into a force for external expansion, forging a name for himself and his people that would echo throughout Europe. He demonstrated that in a world of petty lords and grand ambitions, true royalty could be forged not only by birth, but by the blade of a sword and the mind of a strategist. The popular image of Viking warfare often boils down to berserkers raging and wild hordes descending upon defenseless villages. However, behind the apparent ferocity, there was a surprisingly effective and adaptable art of war, developed over centuries of internal conflicts and honed during incursions into foreign lands. These weren't professional armies in the Roman or later medieval sense, but forces composed of bondi, freemen, jarls, and their herdmen, personal guards, all motivated by the pursuit of glory, plunder, and crucially, honor. Training began early in childhood, where boys learned to handle weapons as part of their daily lives, for hunting, self-defense, and competitions. Viking weaponry was varied and functional. The axe in its various forms, from the light and fast hand axe to the imposing two-handed battle axe, was the iconic and often preferred weapon. It was versatile, capable of piercing armor, delivering crushing blows, and even being thrown. Swords, though more expensive and therefore less common, were symbols of status, expertly forged and passed down through generations. Spears of different sizes were widely used, both for thrusting and throwing, providing reach and piercing power. Shields, round and made of wood reinforced with leather, and a metal boss in the center, were essential for defense and for the Vikings' most famous tactical formation, the shield wall, Skjaldborg. Discipline in the shield wall formation was the backbone of their open field tactics. It was both a defensive and offensive formation, where warriors stood shoulder to shoulder, shields overlapping, creating an impenetrable barrier against arrows and frontal attacks. Within this formation, warriors could use their spears through the gaps or, during an advance, raise their axes to strike enemies. The cohesion of the shield wall depended on individual discipline and mutual trust among the combatants. It was a deadly dance of advances and retreats, where a broken formation could mean slaughter. They used this tactic not only for defense but also for slowly advancing, pushing the enemy back and wearing down their lines. Brutality was an undeniable component of their reputation. Vikings did not shy away from extreme violence, using shock tactics, terrifying war cries, and the imposing appearance of their weapons and armor to demoralize the enemy even before combat. The famous state of berserker, though not universal, was a manifestation of this ferocity, where warriors supposedly entered a trance of rage, becoming seemingly immune to pain and fear, sowing chaos in enemy ranks. This reputation for savagery was, in itself, a weapon, often leading to the surrender of towns and settlements before a battle even began. However, Viking warfare wasn't just blind brutality. It was marked by a remarkable adaptability. They were masters of surprise attacks, using their longships to appear suddenly in rivers and along coasts, launching themselves against unprepared targets, and quickly retreating with their plunder. They were skilled in guerrilla warfare, in ambushes, and in using the terrain to their advantage. They knew when to negotiate and when to fight. The capture of hostages for ransom, the Danegeld, became a common strategy, revealing a pragmatism that went beyond simple pillaging. The art of Viking warfare, therefore, was a reflection of its people, fierce, adaptable, pragmatic, and deeply rooted in a culture that valued courage, honor, and the incessant pursuit of glory and wealth, no matter the cost. This combination of controlled savagery and tactical cunning made them an almost unstoppable force in their time. At the heart of the Viking expansion, and central to the legend of Ragnar Lothbrok, lay a technological innovation that transformed a coastal people into masters of the seas, the Longship. More than mere boats, longships were engineering marvels of their time, a synthesis of design, functionality, and art that allowed the Norse to achieve feats of navigation that seemed impossible. Far from the heavy, deep-keeled vessels of their European contemporaries, the Longship was light, elegant, and, above all, incredibly versatile. Its shallow keel was a revolutionary feature. While other ships needed deep harbors, longships could be beached on almost any shore or riverbank, allowing for swift and unexpected landings virtually anywhere. This ability to navigate shallow waters and, crucially, to ascend rivers for hundreds of miles, transformed Europe's internal waterways into avenues for plunder and trade. Cities like Paris, Rouen, and Seville, which considered themselves safe due to their distance from the sea, suddenly found themselves vulnerable to attacks from inland, a threat that medieval defenses simply weren't prepared to face. The clinker-built construction, where hull planks were overlapped and riveted, not only made the ships lighter and more flexible, but also incredibly strong to withstand the turbulent waves of the North Atlantic. The flexibility of the hull allowed the ship to twist with the waves rather than crash against them, resulting in a smoother and faster journey. Propulsion was twofold: square wool sails for long, efficient voyages with the wind, and oars for quick maneuvers, for navigating against the current or in calm waters. This combination ensured an impressive average speed, capable of covering vast distances in record time for the era. Longships, with their raised bows often adorned with intricately carved dragon or serpent heads, hence the name Longship or Dragon Ship, weren't just instruments of war. They were also vehicles of psychological terror. The sight of dozens of these sinister silhouettes, emerging from the mist or ascending a river, was enough to sow panic in coastal and riverside populations. The sound of hundreds of oars beating in unison, the creak of wood, and the wind in the sails were the harbinger of doom. The Vikings' skill in navigation was equally remarkable. Far from relying solely on sight of the coast, they used the sun, stars, ocean currents, bird flight patterns, and even the color of the water to guide themselves on the open sea. There's evidence of using sunstones, calcite crystals, to determine the sun's position on cloudy days. This mastery allowed them to reach lands as distant as Iceland, Greenland, and even North America, Vinland, long before Columbus. For leaders like Ragnar Lothbrok, the Longship wasn't just a means of transport, it was the essential tool of his ambition. It was naval technology that allowed him not only to raid coasts, but to conceive and execute audacious river incursions, such as the famous Siege of Paris. Without the ability to move large armies and plunder wealth so quickly and efficiently, the Viking Age would have been very different. Longships were the physical manifestation of the Viking spirit, innovative, powerful, fearless, and ready to conquer the unknown. They weren't just vessels, they were the very extension of the will of the men who built and commanded them, paving the way for a new era of exploration, trade, and, of course, conquest. Behind the romantic image of the Viking as a mere adventurer, driven by a thirst for glory and battle, lay a pragmatic and often brutal reality: economic necessity. Scandinavia, though majestic in its natural beauty, was a land of limited resources. Harsh climatic conditions and rocky soil restricted agriculture to certain regions, and the capacity to sustain a growing population was constantly tested. It wasn't a famine in the literal sense of widespread food scarcity at all times, but rather a growing demographic pressure on finite resources, which pushed communities beyond their natural borders. The population increase, however gradual, meant more mouths to feed and, crucially, less available land per family. In a society where land ownership was the basis of wealth and status, the lack of land to inherit or cultivate was a serious problem, especially for younger sons of families who didn't own large properties. For these young men, options were limited: remain as landless laborers, submit to a local jarl, or seek fortune and new lands elsewhere. The second option, the Viking raid, offered not only a chance to survive but to ascend socially, acquire honor, and become a man of means. The search for riches was the immediate driver of the incursions. Gold and silver were the most coveted goods, not just as status symbols but as capital that could be used to buy land, forge better quality weapons, acquire luxury goods, or for trade. The monasteries and churches of Christian Europe were particularly attractive targets. Rich in gold, silver, jewels, and liturgical objects, and often undefended, they represented virtually untouched treasure troves. For the pagan Vikings, the desecration of these sites did not carry the same moral weight as for Christians, and the plunder obtained was seen as a deserved reward for their courage and effort. Besides precious metals, wealth also included luxury items such as silks, spices, wines, and jewelry, which could be used for ostentation or exchanged for other goods. The plundering of cities brought a variety of valuable items that enriched the warriors and their jarls. Another highly valuable commodity, and a brutal reality of the era, were slaves. Many of those captured in raids were brought back to Scandinavia to work on farms or were sold in slave markets, generating significant profits for the expedition leaders. This additional workforce eased the pressure on local labor and increased the productive capacity of Viking properties. For leaders like Ragnar Lothbrok, economic motivation was inseparable from the pursuit of glory. A successful leader was one who brought abundant spoils to his men, ensuring their loyalty and attracting more warriors for future expeditions. The promise of riches was a powerful incentive to risk one's life in distant lands. The hunger for land and riches wasn't just a matter of survival, but of prosperity and power. It was the driving force behind the audacity to cross unknown seas, to face well-equipped armies, and to challenge the political and religious structures of Europe. Thus, the Viking Age wasn't just an explosion of violence, but also a great wave of entrepreneurship, driven by necessity and material ambition, that would reshape the political and economic map of the continent. The Viking expansion wasn't just a military and economic phenomenon. It was, in its essence, a monumental cultural clash, a collision between two worlds with diametrically opposed views of life, gods, and values. On one side, the pagan and warrior society of the North, with its reverence for strength, for honor in battle, for a pantheon of capricious gods, and for a cosmology where fate was predetermined and glorious death was the pinnacle of existence. On the other, the more developed Christian cultures of continental Europe and the British Isles, with their imposing cathedrals, their monasteries full of knowledge and riches, their kings anointed by God, and a faith that preached peace, charity, and salvation of the soul. Although in practice violence was a constant, for the Vikings the other was not just an enemy to be conquered, but an inexhaustible source of plunder and a new understanding of the world. Monasteries filled with gold, silver, jewels, and valuable objects were easy and profitable targets, seen by them not as inviolable sanctuaries, but as undefended storehouses of wealth. The fact that these treasures were in places sacred to Christians was irrelevant to the Viking mindset, which did not share the same reverence. The plunder of Lindisfarne in 793 AD was a landmark precisely because of this desecration, which shocked Christendom and revealed the cruelty and pragmatism of the Norse invaders. Language and religion were the most obvious barriers. The Vikings spoke Old Norse, and their faith was rooted in Odin, Thor, and the other gods of Asgard. To them, the Christian god seemed weak, unable to protect his own temples and followers. The idea that a god could die on a cross for his faithful was, to the Norse warrior mentality, a sign of weakness, not divine sacrifice. In contrast, their own gods were powerful, combative, and demanded feats of bravery. Social and political organization also differed drastically. While the Christian kingdoms of the South had feudal structures, with kings, nobles, and an organized church that provided an administrative backbone, Scandinavia was, as we have seen, a cluster of jarls and tribal chieftains. This lack of centralized authority in the Norse kingdoms paradoxically made them more agile and unpredictable in their incursions, as they did not depend on orders from a distant capital. However, the clash was not unidirectional and did not always result in violence. There were also cultural exchanges. Through trade and settlement, the Vikings absorbed elements of Christian cultures, and vice versa. Norse words entered Old English, and Christian concepts began to infiltrate Norse communities, paving the way for the future Christianization of Scandinavia. The very way Christian chroniclers recorded Viking incursions shaped our perception of them today. The image of barbarians and pagans was a reflection of fear and aversion, but also of reluctant admiration for their indomitable courage. For Ragnar Lothbrok, this cultural contrast was an advantage. He and his men exploited the perceived weaknesses of the Christian world, its apparent undefended wealth, its lack of military readiness, and the surprise caused by their brutal methods. The reputation of being devils from the sea who feared neither god nor man, was a weapon in itself. In confronting the South, Ragnar was not just plundering, he was challenging a world order, showing that power resided not only in great empires and organized religions, but also in the audacity, strength, and capacity of a people determined to redefine the limits of their own world. The clash of cultures was, ultimately, what propelled the Vikings to prominence and forced Europe to adapt or perish. Amidst the unrest and constant power struggles in Scandinavia, and as the echoes of the first Viking incursions began to resonate throughout Europe, the figure of Ragnar Lothbrok started to emerge from anonymity. His initial feats were not the great expeditions that would ravage Paris or England, but rather smaller, yet significant actions that pulled him from obscurity and paved his way to legend. These were the murmurs that would transform into songs, and the small victories that foreshadowed monumental conquests. Ragnar was not born to a throne. He forged his path through his own cunning and bravery. Sagas, even the most fantastical, agree that he stood out for his singular courage from a very young age. Before becoming the famous legendary Viking, he was a talented warrior, a man who was not content with the life of a farmer or a clan warrior. Ambition burned in his chest, a hunger for recognition and glory that drove him to seek challenges. These early incursions were crucial for him to test his skills and those of his companions. They were not attacks on large cities, but raids on less protected coastal settlements, small expeditions that, nonetheless, were rich in experience. In them, Ragnar learned the secrets of coastal navigation, the tactics of rapid disembarkation, and the value of surprise. The formation of his initial crew was a vital step. In the Viking world, a leader was only as strong as the men who followed him. Ragnar attracted a loyal group of warriors, men who saw in him not just a chieftain, but a comrade in arms, someone worthy of trust who would lead them to great riches. Loyalty was forged in the heat of battle and in the fair division of spoils. Sagas frequently describe how he inspired devotion, with his men willing to follow him on any venture, no matter how dangerous. Ragnar's reputation grew with each successful return, and stories of his audacity and success in raids began to spread through the Norse lands. The recognition of his cunning was a turning point. It wasn't just brute force that distinguished him, but his tactical intelligence. He observed, planned, and executed with a shrewdness that surpassed many of his contemporaries. The ability to anticipate enemy movements, to choose the right moment to attack, and to adapt quickly to unexpected situations, made him a feared and respected leader. Even in small skirmishes, he demonstrated a sharp mind for warfare. His men saw in him the ability to turn them into victors, to lead them to places no other Viking leader had dared to go. Thus, the first murmurs of Ragnar were not just about a courageous warrior, but about a leader who possessed a rare combination of ferocity and intelligence. These were the stories whispered around bonfires, the songs sung by skalds, that began to cement his reputation. Every small raid, every tactical victory, and every man who joined his cause was a brick in the construction of his future legend. He was preparing himself, and the world, unknowingly, was about to feel the impact of a name that would resonate through the centuries. If this story of ambition and courage has already gripped you, you need to see what comes next. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any epic journeys, and hit the bell to be notified whenever a new legend is revealed. Your support is crucial for us to spread knowledge about these fascinating chapters of history. And to connect even more, tell us in the comments from what part of the world you're watching and embarking on this adventure. As Ragnar Lothbrok's fame grew in his native Scandinavia, propelled by whispers of his early incursions and the skill of his cunning, a greater restlessness began to ferment in his mind. He was no longer content with minor raids, local glories, or petty disputes among rival jarls. The man who had defeated serpents and solidified his reputation in small victories now looked west, to the rich and seemingly inexhaustible lands that tales from merchants and rare explorers brought back. The shadow of the raven, Odin's symbol of war, no longer loomed only over familiar fjords but over vast unknown seas, whispering promises of unprecedented glory. Ragnar's decision to seek a larger, more rewarding target was not made lightly. It was born from a combination of personal ambition and insatiable thirst for fame. immortal glory, and the growing population pressure in his own land. The plunder from smaller raids, though useful, was not enough to sustain the loyalty of an ever-growing group of ambitious warriors. To maintain his position and continue to attract the bravest, Ragnar needed something grand, something that would guarantee not only riches, but also a place in the sagas that would be sung for centuries. Christian Europe, with its monasteries full of treasures and cities prospering on navigable rivers, presented itself as an irresistible temptation, fertile ground for Viking ambition. The conception of a grand expedition required not only courage, but a strategic vision that few possessed. No previous Viking incursion had ventured so deeply into the heart of a continental kingdom as he planned. It wasn't just about crossing the sea, but about sailing deep inland via rivers, far from the safety of the coast, a tactic that would demand a fleet of perfectly constructed longships and exemplary military organization. Ragnar, with his keen intelligence, understood that success would depend on surprise and audacity. He needed a target that was rich enough to justify the risk, and at the same time, vulnerable enough to be conquered by his forces. The crossing to the west, particularly to the Frankish kingdom, represented the pinnacle of this daring. The Franks, though powerful, were divided by internal disputes among Charlemagne's heirs. This disunity was the crack in the armor that Ragnar knew how to exploit. The promise of plunder in such rich lands, combined with the chance to humble a Christian empire, was the perfect bait to attract warriors from all corners of Scandinavia. The idea of sailing up the Seine to Paris itself, the capital of the West Frankish kingdom, was not just a military plan. It was a direct challenge to the established order, a declaration of war by the pagan North against Christendom. The choice of Paris as the central target resonated with the Viking mentality of seeking glory. Conquering the most important city of one of Europe's greatest kingdoms would be an unparalleled feat, a cry of power that would echo across the continent and beyond. Thus, while artisans worked on building new longships and warriors sharpened their blades, Ragnar's mind charted the maps of an epic journey. The Raven's shadow, once an omen, now became a guide, pointing west, towards glory and the inevitable conflict that would change the course of history and consolidate Ragnar Lothbrok's name as the most legendary of Vikings. With the decision sealed to cross the waters and devastate the Frankish lands, Ragnar Lothbrok turned his formidable energy to the arduous task of assembling and preparing the largest fleet Scandinavia had ever seen under a single command. This was no minor expedition, but a true task force, a gathering of warriors and ships that would embody growing Viking audacity. News of Ragnar's plans spread like the cold north wind, sweeping through fjords and valleys, reaching the ears of jarls and carls, freemen, who, seduced by the promise of incalculable plunder and immortal glory, began to converge on the meeting points. The gathering of warriors was a spectacle of power and determination. Men of all ages, from the young seeking their first fame to the veterans scarred by countless battles, answered Ragnar's call. They came armed with polished axes, sharp swords, and shields painted with symbols of their clans and gods. Forming such a vast host required more than charisma. It demanded impeccable logistics, feeding, equipping, and coordinating thousands of men, each with their own vessel and their own loyalty, was a colossal challenge that only a leader of Ragnar's stature could undertake. He needed to ensure there would be enough food for the journey, fresh water, repair equipment for the ships, and above all, the promise of a fair reward for everyone who risked their life under his banner. Parallel to the gathering of men was the construction and preparation of the fleet. The rudimentary shipyards along the Scandinavian fjords and rivers hummed with activity. New keels were laid, planks were overlapped and riveted with thousands of iron nails, and the intricate prows of the longships began to take shape. Each ship was a work of art and engineering, designed for speed, stability, and transport capacity. Artisans worked tirelessly, knowing that the lives of their brothers and the glory of their people depended on the perfection of their craft. Wool sails were woven, oars carved, and ropes tested for strength. Ragnar's fleet was composed not only of warships but also of cargo vessels, gnar, that would carry supplies, horses, and all the necessary equipment for a prolonged campaign. The ability to transport horses on board was a significant tactical advantage, allowing Viking forces to move more quickly on land after disembarkation, catching defenders by surprise. The exact number of ships and men in this great fleet varies in the sagas, but Frankish chronicles speak of hundreds of vessels and thousands of warriors, an impressive force that few European kingdoms could assemble, let alone contain. The challenge of organizing so many men and ships was immense. It required Ragnar's highest form of leadership and organization. He appointed his most trusted jarls and captains to command the different divisions of the fleet, establishing signals and codes for communication at sea, and ensuring that everyone understood their role in the larger plan. The sagas portray him walking among his men, inspiring confidence and reinforcing the vision of glory that awaited them in the west. It was a time of intense preparation, where tension and anticipation hung in the air. Each longship that slid into the water, each warrior who embarked, was another step towards the fulfillment of Ragnar Lothbrok's audacious vision. Ragnar's great fleet was not just a collection of boats and men, it was the materialization of an era, a growing shadow over distant lands, ready to strike a blow that would resonate throughout Europe. With his grandiose fleet assembled and the vision of glory burning in his warriors' eyes, Ragnar Lothbrok set sail, heading towards the mists of the west, where the rich lands of the British Isles awaited. His first great incursions would focus on the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms of Northumbria and Wessex, fertile lands that were, for the most part, unprepared for the Viking fury that was to come. The sound of keels cutting through the waves was the symphony of an imminent destiny, a harbinger of terror for the monks and peasants living near the coast. The first landings in England were marked by the speed and brutality that would become the trademark of Viking attacks. Unlike formal military invasions, Ragnar's incursions were about surprise and impact. Longships with their shallow keels could emerge from seemingly innocuous rivers and estuaries, anchoring on isolated beaches and allowing hundreds of warriors to disembark in minutes. The priority targets were rich and undefended, monasteries and coastal towns. These places, filled with treasures accumulated over centuries, gold, silver, jewels, illuminated books, were storehouses of wealth without significant military protection. For the pagan Vikings, the sacred nature of these places was irrelevant. What mattered was the loot. The terror imposed on unprepared monasteries, towns, and populations was immediate and overwhelming. Monks and nuns, dedicated to prayer and study, were slaughtered or enslaved. Villages were burned, crops destroyed, and cattle slaughtered. The speed of the attacks was such that local militias and the defense forces of the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, dispersed and poorly coordinated, barely had time to react. The cry, "The Vikings are coming," spread like a plague, but often it was too late. What differentiated Ragnar's attacks from earlier minor incursions was their scale and coordination. He led a larger group, capable of overwhelming isolated resistances and causing much deeper economic and psychological damage. The first clashes with Anglo-Saxon defenses revealed the disparity in tactics and mindset. The Anglo-Saxons, though brave warriors, were accustomed to a more formal, land-based type of warfare. Their defenses relied on strongholds and pitched battles, not on an amphibious threat that could emerge from anywhere along the coast or river. The Fyrd, local militias summoned in times of war, were slow to mobilize and often poorly equipped and trained to face the Vikings' ferocity and mobility. Ragnar and his men, on the other hand, were masters of mobile warfare, using hit-and-run tactics, accumulating riches, and undermining the enemy's morale. News of the raids in Northumbria and Wessex reverberated throughout England, creating a widespread climate of panic. Anglo-Saxon kings such as King Ælla of Northumbria and the monarchs of Wessex began to grasp the magnitude of the new threat. The riches Ragnar brought back to Scandinavia were not just plunder. They were fuel for future expeditions, proof that the legends told of golden lands were true. These initial incursions were the baptism of fire for Ragnar's great fleet, a harbinger that the era of sporadic pillaging was over. A new era of large-scale invasions, led by legendary figures like Ragnar, was just beginning to unfold over Christian lands, leaving a trail of fire and terror. Ragnar Lothbrok's reputation as an exceptional Viking leader was not based solely on his personal bravery or the strength of his warriors, but, crucially, on his warfare strategy. Far from being a berserker blind with rage, Ragnar was a master of tactics, employing a lethal combination of speed and ferocity that destabilized his enemies and guaranteed the success of his audacious endeavors. He understood that the greatest Viking weapon was not just the axe, but surprise, and the ability to strike where the enemy was weakest and least prepared. Surprise was the central element of his approach. Thanks to the versatility of longships, which could navigate shallow coastal waters and penetrate deeply into river systems, Ragnar and his men could appear out of nowhere. A monastery at a river mouth, a city on an affluent or a coastal village feeling safe from the open sea, suddenly found themselves facing hundreds of Norse warriors. There were no robust river fortifications, and the military organization of the Frankish and Anglo-Saxon kingdoms was geared towards land threats, defending their external borders, not their internal hearts. The sight of dragon ships was often the first and only warning. Speed was the perfect complement to surprise. Once disembarked, Ragnar's Vikings attacked with frantic energy. Plundering was quick and methodical. They did not linger in prolonged sieges unless strictly necessary. Their objective was to acquire loot and flee before an organized military response could be mobilized. This meant that, often, the local population and defense forces were caught in the midst of confusion, with no time to gather enough men to face the Viking wave. This tactic of swift raids and retreat was devastating, both materially and psychologically. Ferocity was the final, terrifying layer of his strategy. Vikings did not shy away from extreme violence, and the brutality they employed in their attacks served a purpose beyond simple annihilation. Burning villages, massacring clerics, and plundering churches was not just about acquiring goods. It was about sowing terror. The Vikings' reputation for cruelty preceded them, often leading to mass surrender or flight of populations, which further facilitated the raids. This reputation, fueled by real acts and by legends, was a powerful psychological weapon, turning the very name Viking into a cry of panic. Ragnar was also a master of asymmetric warfare. He did not seek pitched battles against numerically superior or heavily armed armies. Instead, he exploited the mobility of his fleet and the disorganization of his enemies. When facing strong resistance, he retreated and sought a new target, or used guerrilla tactics to wear down enemy forces. He also understood the power of the Danegeld, the ransom paid for the Vikings to leave. This was a recognition of his strength and a source of wealth without the need for prolonged, costly combat. Ragnar Lothbrok's strategy was, therefore, a demonstration of his military genius. He transformed the vulnerability of European kingdoms, their wealth accessible by rivers, their complacency, and their lack of readiness for mobile warfare, into his greatest advantage. By combining relentless speed, surprising attacks, and demoralizing ferocity, Ragnar did not just plunder cities. He redefined the art of warfare in his era, solidifying his legacy as one of the most formidable leaders of the Viking Age. Of all Ragnar Lothbrok's audacious acts, none compares to his bold decision to sail his vast fleet up the winding river Seine, towards the heart of the West Frankish kingdom, with the aim of plundering the prosperous and symbolic city of Paris in the year 845 AD. This was no mere coastal raid. It was a direct challenge to the power and faith of the Carolingian Empire, a calculated blow that would echo throughout Christendom. The conception of the riverine incursion to Paris demonstrates Ragnar's strategic genius. He understood that the city, though fortified by land, was vulnerable by river. Navigating the Seine, with its bends and bridges, was a complex challenge. But the promise of a city so rich and largely unprepared for an internal naval attack justified the risk. Ragnar's scouts had likely brought back information about the city's defenses and, crucially, about the unstable political situation of the Frankish kingdom, divided among Charlemagne's heirs. The arrival of the Viking fleet on the River Seine was a terrifying spectacle. More than 100 longships with their dragon prows slicing through the water, carrying thousands of warriors, emerged from the morning mists. The sight of this immense armada, stretching for miles along the river, was a nightmare come true for the inhabitants of Paris. The roar of their oars in unison, the glint of steel from their weapons, and the war cries of the men from the north announced the imminent catastrophe. The Franks' reaction was one of panic and despair. Emperor Charles the Bald, then King of West Francia, was unprepared. His forces were scattered, and he had underestimated the Vikings' ability to penetrate so deeply into his territory. He attempted to raise an army to stem the advance, but the speed of the Viking fleet and the surprise of the riverine attack rendered his initial efforts insufficient. A small defensive force was sent to halt the Vikings at Saint-Denis, but it was quickly overwhelmed, and Frankish morale plummeted. The abbot of the monastery, who had tried to negotiate, saw his sacred relics plundered, a grim omen of what awaited the capital. The beginning of the siege of Paris was an event of epic proportions. Ragnar did not attempt an immediate frontal assault. He set up his camp on the islands of the Seine, strategically positioned to control the river approaches to the city. His warriors began to plunder the surrounding areas, securing supplies and terrorizing the rural population. The city of Paris at the time was primarily confined to the Île de la Cité, an island in the middle of the Seine, fortified by walls and bridges. The challenge for Ragnar was to breach these defenses, while the challenge for Charles the Bald was to protect his capital without adequate military force to directly confront the invaders. The siege of Paris was not just a military battle, it was a test of wills. On one side, Ragnar's relentless determination to achieve glory and wealth. On the other, the despair of an empire that saw its faith and power challenged by a force that seemed to come from hell itself. The smoke from the burned villages around Paris rose to the heavens, and the stench of destruction hung over the city, while the Seine, once a waterway of commerce and life, became the river of death and ruin, all under the watchful and calculating eye of Ragnar Lothbrok. As Ragnar Lothbrok's imposing fleet positioned itself around Paris, despair and panic gripped the Frankish population. The city, though a crucial administrative and religious center, was unprepared for a threat of this magnitude and nature. Paris, in that 9th century, was a growing city, but its defenses were more suited for land-based threats, not for a naval invasion coming upriver, directly into the heart of its strongholds. The main city was located on the Île de la Cité, an island in the middle of the Seine, connected to the banks by wooden and stone bridges. The Frankish resistance began with a mixture of isolated bravery and disorganization. Emperor Charles the Bald, Charlemagne's grandson, found himself in a precarious position. His empire was fragmented by succession disputes, and he did not possess a centralized army strong enough to face a force as massive and agile as Ragnar's. Local militias and a few military contingents tried to oppose the initial Viking landings in the outskirts of Paris, but they were quickly overwhelmed by the ferocity and numbers of the attackers. Paris's fortifications consisted mainly of walls protecting the central island, and, crucially, the fortified bridges connecting the island to the north and south banks of the Seine. These bridges were the main lines of defense, as they prevented Ragnar's longships from passing and dividing the city. However, the garrison of Paris was small and poorly equipped for a prolonged siege. The lack of a unified chain of command and the shaken morale from the speed and brutality of the Viking attacks contributed to the initial inability to stem the Viking advance. The challenges for the Franks were multifaceted. First, surprise. The Vikings' ability to sail so far upriver caught everyone off guard. There was no effective early warning system for riverine invasions. Second, speed. Ragnar's raids and maneuvers were so swift that Frankish forces could not mobilize in time to offer cohesive resistance. Third, the tactical superiority of the Vikings in the type of warfare they waged. They were masters of amphibious assaults and mobile warfare, while the Franks were more accustomed to pitched battles and traditional sieges. The panic in the capital was palpable. The inhabitants of Paris, accustomed to relative peace and the protection of their empire, found themselves besieged by a horde of pagans who seemed to fear nothing. Screams of terror mingled with the sound of axes and fires spreading through the outskirts. Churches were filled with worshippers crying out for miracles, but the Norse gods seemed to be on the side of the invaders. Many fled, taking what they could, but most were trapped. Charles the Bald attempted both a diplomatic and military approach. He gathered what he could of his army and tried a flanking maneuver against the Vikings, but the attempt was a disaster. Seeing the futility of a direct confrontation, and with his capital under imminent threat, he found himself forced to consider a less honorable, but perhaps inevitable solution. The defense of Paris was not just a matter of walls and soldiers, it was a matter of faith, morale, and the ability of a divided empire to face a united and relentless force. And at that moment, under the shadow of Ragnar's fleet, the Franks were failing. The siege of Paris was not merely a display of Viking brute force, but a testament to Ragnar Lothbrok's strategic cunning. More than just a warrior, Ragnar proved himself a master of psychological warfare and negotiation, employing tactics that wore down the Frankish defenders and humiliated Emperor Charles the Bald himself, without the need for total slaughter. Ragnar understood that a prolonged and bloody siege could be costly for his own men. His strategy was not simply to invade and destroy, but to obtain maximum plunder with minimum casualties. To do this, he employed a series of psychological and military tactics that kept Paris under constant pressure. He did not immediately attack the fortified bridges of the main island, but focused on strategic attacks and retreats. His warriors harassed the defenses with minor incursions and skirmishes, testing the morale and readiness of the defenders. Each attack, even if repelled, consumed Frankish resources and kept them exhausted and in a constant state of alert. While the city was besieged, Ragnar allowed his men to plunder the outskirts of Paris with impunity. Villages, farms, and, crucially, nearby monasteries and churches were targets for looting and burning. The smoke from burning structures rose to the heavens, visible from within the walls of Paris, serving as a constant reminder of what would happen if the city did not yield. This tactic aimed not only to accumulate additional spoils, but also to deepen the terror and panic among the population, who watched the destruction draw ever closer. Ragnar's true masterstroke, however, was his demand for ransom, the famous Danegeld, Danish money. Instead of a bloody final siege, he proposed that Paris could be spared total destruction if Emperor Charles the Bald paid an exorbitant sum of gold and silver. This was not a new tactic for the Vikings, but in Paris it was applied on an unprecedented scale. The demand for the Danegeld placed Charles in a terrible dilemma: fight an unbeatable force and see his capital destroyed, or pay and humiliate himself, but save the city. The humiliation of Emperor Charles the Bald was Ragnar's true triumph. By agreeing to pay the Danegeld, Charles not only admitted his inability to defend his own kingdom against the pagans, but also reinforced the Vikings' image of invincibility. Ragnar, with his shrewdness, knew that this concession would set a dangerous precedent for the future of the Frankish kingdom. The emperor, a direct descendant of Charlemagne, was forced to negotiate with a pagan barbarian rather than expel him by force of arms. Sagas and some Frankish chronicles recount that in a final act of scorn, Ragnar and his men even entered the city on Easter Sunday, a sacred day for Christians, before withdrawing after receiving the ransom. This symbolic desecration was an additional psychological blow, showing Viking contempt for the Christian faith and the impotence of its defenders. Ragnar's cunning in Paris demonstrated that he was not just a formidable war leader, but a complex strategist, capable of manipulating the politics, economics, and psychology of his enemies to achieve his objectives, further solidifying his legend as the most cunning of Viking leaders. The morning mist hanging over the Seine on March 29, 845 AD, seemed to carry the weight of surrender. Paris, the jewel of the West Frankish kingdom, had yielded. It was not through a bloody final assault, but by the force of a humiliating negotiation. Emperor Charles the Bald, exhausted, powerless, and with his capital under imminent threat of annihilation, had no choice but to accept Ragnar Lothbrok's terms. The sum of 7,000 pounds of silver and gold, approximately 2,500 kilograms of silver, was the price of peace, the Danegeld that would buy the Vikings' withdrawal. This was Ragnar's most emblematic victory, not just military, but strategic and symbolic. The Vikings' entry into Paris after the agreement was not a chaotic assault, but a march of occupation. Although Frankish chronicles described the terror, Ragnar's presence imposed a degree of order. His warriors did not launch into a general and indiscriminate looting of all houses and churches, as the greater spoils had already been promised. Instead, the entry served for the collection of the ransom and for an unquestionable assertion of their dominance. The silver and gold were meticulously weighed, ensuring the promise was kept. The streets that once buzzed with trade now echoed with the Vikings' footsteps, and the gazes of the Parisians were a mix of fear, relief, and humiliation. However, the symbolic destruction of some points was not avoided. Before their departure, and perhaps as a final act of pagan desecration, some monasteries and churches, which had not been completely emptied of their treasures or served as points of resistance, were burned or plundered, even after the Danegeld was paid. This act of calculated violence served to reinforce the message. The Vikings were not mere mercenaries who could be bought and forgotten. They were a force that could impose its will, and their departure was a concession, not a retreat. The burning of these sacred structures, on such a significant day for Christians, like Easter Sunday, according to some sources, solidified the Christian Empire's humiliation before pagan power. The sack of Paris was the pinnacle of Ragnar's fame. He had done what no other Viking leader had achieved before: penetrate the heart of the Frankish kingdom, besiege its capital, and force its emperor to pay an astronomical sum to save it. The riches taken from Paris were not just material. They were undeniable proof of his hamingja, his luck and divine favor. For his warriors, the plunder was immense, guaranteeing loyalty for future expeditions and elevating the status of every man who participated in that journey. For the Norse peoples, the news spread like wildfire, and Ragnar became the personification of Viking success, the model to be followed. For the Christian world, the fall of Paris was a devastating shock, a sign that the defenses of Christendom were not impregnable. The Danegeld policy would become a dangerous precedent, encouraging future Viking attacks, as the invaders learned that wealth could be obtained with less bloodshed than in great battles. Ragnar's victory in Paris was not just a battle won. It was a demonstration of his tactical shrewdness, his mastery of psychological warfare, and his ability to transform an incursion into a legend, forever marking his name in the annals of Viking history. Paris, at that moment, was not just sacked, it was conquered, and the memory of the humiliation would persist for generations. Ragnar Lothbrok's legend wasn't built solely on his own deeds, but also on the glory and ferocity of his offspring. The sagas portray him not just as a great warrior, but as the patriarch of a lineage of heroes, whose names would echo even louder in the annals of Viking history. The sons of Ragnar, Ivar the Boneless, Bjorn Ironside, Halfdan, Ubbe, and Sigurd Snake in the Eye, were in life their father's true legacy, each destined to forge their own path of conquest and spread Norse influence throughout Europe. Ragnar's relationship with his sons is depicted as complex and ambitious. He saw them not just as heirs, but as extensions of his own power and his relentless pursuit of glory. From an early age, the sons were trained in the arts of warfare, navigation, and leadership, immersed in the same sagas and myths that shaped their father's ambition. Ragnar took them on his expeditions, allowing them to gain combat experience, learn raid and plunder tactics, and build their own reputations. He challenged them, sometimes brutally, to prove their worth, overcome their weaknesses, and become warriors worthy of his name. Ivar the Boneless is often described as the most cunning and cruel of the sons, a brilliant strategist who, despite a possible physical condition that prevented him from walking, hence the nickname, compensated with a sharp mind and calculated cruelty. His tactical intelligence would make him a formidable leader. Bjorn Ironside was considered a powerful warrior, whose strength and combat skills were legendary. He would lead incursions towards the Mediterranean, further expanding Viking horizons. Halfdan in turn would be a central figure in the invasion of England, co-leading the great heathen army alongside Ivar. Ubbe and Sigurd Snake in the Eye would also distinguish themselves as leaders and warriors, each with their own exploits and domains. His son's presence allowed Ragnar to expand his operations and maintain pressure on multiple fronts. He could delegate expeditions to them, testing their leadership capabilities and allowing them to gain their own plunder and followers. The sagas narrate how the sons often operated independently, but under their father's shadow, which only increased the aura of power of the Lothbrok family. The fact that several of his sons are famous in their own historical rights something rare for the offspring of a single leader of that era, is a testament to Ragnar's influence. They began to emerge as great warriors not only in their own expeditions, but also in how they continued the quest for glory. The competition among them, though healthy in some aspects, could also be a source of tension, but all shared the same goal of surpassing their father's deeds and engraving their own names in history. The true power of Ragnar's lineage lay in its continuity. Even if the sagas confuse what he actually did, there's no doubt about the impact of his sons, who transformed raids into territorial conquests and established Viking kingdoms in foreign lands. Ragnar's legacy wasn't just about himself, but about the dynasty he had started, a dynasty of warriors and conquerors who would change the map of Europe. After the spectacular sack of Paris, Ragnar Lothbrok's fame reached its peak, echoing throughout Scandinavia and spreading terror across Christian lands. But for Ragnar, glory was a feast that never satisfied his hunger. The vast amount of silver and gold obtained in Paris, though immense, was not an end in itself, but a means, fuel for new and even more ambitious incursions. Ragnar's thirst for conquest was insatiable, driven not only by riches, but by a constant pursuit of fame, to prove his superiority and to test the limits of his own destiny. He did not settle for victory. Instead, he continued his incursions, moving with the same speed and ferocity that had distinguished him. His longships once again cut through the waves, targeting new coasts and rivers. The sagas and chronicles of the time mention that, even after Paris, Ragnar and his sons led expeditions in various directions, testing the defenses of other Frankish kingdoms, exploring the coasts of England again, and perhaps even venturing into more distant regions, such as the Mediterranean, although these latter incursions are more often attributed to his sons. The pursuit of new glories and riches was the primary motivation. Ragnar's reputation attracted even more warriors, seduced by the promise of plunder and the chance to fight under the command of a seemingly invincible leader. Each new incursion was an opportunity to reinforce this image, to accumulate more treasures, and to solidify the loyalty of his herdmen. For Ragnar, success bred more success, and inactivity was synonymous with decline. The legend needed to be constantly fed with new deeds. The expansion of his influence was also a key objective. Although he did not seek to establish a unified territorial empire in the Carolingian sense, the imposition of Danegeld and the submission of cities and regions to his temporary power increased his authority and prestige. He became a figure to be feared, and at times to be negotiated with. The ability to demand tribute from Christian kings demonstrated a supremacy that few pagans had achieved. These continuous incursions kept European kingdoms in a state of constant alert, unable to fully recover from one attack before the next arrived. Ragnar also used these new campaigns to continue the training and testing of his sons. He sent them to lead their own fleets and incursions, allowing them to develop their leadership skills and strategies. It was during this period that figures like Bjorn Ironside and Ivar the Boneless truly began to forge their own legends, often surpassing their own deeds and becoming leaders in their own right. This delegation of conquest allowed Ragnar's war machine to operate on multiple fronts, increasing pressure on Europe and expanding the reach of Viking terror. In his relentless thirst for conquest, Ragnar Lothbrok personified the spirit of the Viking Age at its peak. He knew that glory was not static. It was a constant flow of challenges overcome, horizons explored, and plunder accumulated. Even with the fame of Paris, he continued to advance, pushing the boundaries of what a Viking leader could achieve until fate, or arrogance, led him to his last and fatal voyage. His life was a testament to the fact that, for a true Viking warrior, the journey of conquest never ended. Despite his glories and the fame that preceded him, Ragnar Lothbrok's legend, like all great things, began to face the inevitable wear and tear of time and its own success. The climax of the conquest of Paris, which should have been the crowning achievement of his career, paradoxically marked the beginning of his fall. The man who had defied kings and empires now found himself confronted by more insidious enemies, unbridled pride, and the internal challenges that arose within his own family and among his peers. The insatiable pursuit of fame and plunder, which was once his greatest strength, began to transform into an obsession that would lead him to make increasingly risky decisions. Success bred an arrogance that prevented him from recognizing his own limits and the growing dangers. The Christian world, though terrified, was not idle. It was learning and adapting its defenses. Ragnar, accustomed to easy victories, may have underestimated his enemy's ability to reorganize and set traps. One of the greatest internal challenges, and perhaps the most painful, was the growing rivalry with his own sons. Ivar the Boneless, Bjorn Ironside, Halfdan, and the others had grown up in their father's colossal shadow, but now they were men in their own right, with their own ambitions and their own armies. They had led successful incursions on their own, gaining fame and riches that rivaled Ragnar's. This ascent inevitably led to friction. Sagas often depict arguments about which son was most favored, about the division of spoils, and about who should lead the next great expeditions. The weariness of travel also began to weigh heavily. Years of raiding, sailing through stormy seas, and brutal combat took their physical and mental toll. Long absences from home meant that the administration of their own lands and the care of their families were compromised. Although the life of a Viking was one of constant movement, even the strongest felt the burden of age and the need to consolidate what had been conquered. Some of his most loyal men, enriched and tired, perhaps wished to settle down and enjoy the fruits of their labor, rather than embark on another dangerous adventure. Furthermore, competition with other jarls and Viking leaders also intensified. Ragnar's glory was a beacon but also a target. Other ambitious leaders, seeing his success, sought to emulate his deeds or even surpass him. Alliances in the Viking world were fluid, and envy could be as dangerous as an overt enemy. Ragnar constantly needed to reaffirm his position, which led him to new and riskier expeditions to prove that he was still the greatest. The phase in which Ragnar's legend begins to face wear and tear is a reminder that even the greatest heroes are not immune to the consequences of their own success and the inevitable march of time. The cracks in his armor would not come from an enemy arrow, but from within, from the pride that blinded him, the ambition of his own sons, and the weariness that accumulated after a lifetime of conquests. This combination of internal factors and the growing power of his external enemies would pave the way for his last and fatal voyage, ending a cycle of glory with a legendary fall. The luster of Ragnar Lothbrok's past conquests, though still intense, began to be overshadowed by the looming specter of his approaching fate. Driven by his pride and the need to reaffirm his supremacy over his sons, who were already enjoying their own glories, Ragnar embarked on what would be his last and most controversial expedition. Sagas differ in details, but the consensus points to an audacious yet ill-fated voyage to Northumbria, or, in some versions, Ireland, a kingdom he had successfully raided in bygone times, but which would now be better prepared. Ragnar's decision to sail to Northumbria with only 2 longships or a reduced number of vessels, rather than a great fleet like those that took him to Paris, is one of the most debated points of his saga. Some interpret this as an act of blind arrogance, a belief in his own invincibility, disregarding the threat that King Ælla of Northumbria represented. Others see it as a last desperate act to regain the favor of the gods and surpass his son's growing fame, proving that he, the legendary Ragnar, was still the greatest. It is the story of the last raven flying alone, seeking a final battle. The journey was, from the outset, marked by misfortune. A violent storm, or a navigational error, caused his ships to run aground on the coast of Northumbria. Without the advantage of surprise and with his forces severely diminished by the loss of vessels, Ragnar and his few men found themselves in a desperate situation, far from any escape route. This was the turning point, where the cunning and ferocity that had served him so well could not overcome the numerical disadvantage and hostile terrain. It was then that the forces of King Ælla, who had grown stronger and learned from previous Viking incursions, came into action. Ælla was not a weak king. He had sworn revenge against the Vikings for their raids, and particularly against Ragnar, if the sagas are true, who might have killed Ælla's father in an earlier raid or inflicted an unbearable humiliation. Ragnar and his few followers bravely resisted, fighting with the ferocity of cornered wolves. However, the disparity in forces was overwhelming. Ælla's men, well organized and motivated by the defense of their land and by vengeance, surrounded and finally subdued the legendary Viking. The capture of Ragnar Lothbrok was not a moment of glory for King Ælla in the sense of a victory in a pitched battle against an army, but rather the capture of a valuable prey. In the eyes of Christian chroniclers, it was divine justice reaching an infamous pagan. For Ragnar himself, it meant the end of his freedom and the beginning of his ultimate ordeal. The circumstances of his defeat, without a great battle, but by a combination of misfortune and overestimation of his own invincibility, make his fall even more tragic and, at the same time, highlight the strength of his character that would lead him to face the end with dignity. The legend of Ragnar Lothbrok was preparing for its final act, one that would not be with sword in hand, but of prophecy and sacrifice, cementing his name not only by his raids, but by how he would face his end and inspire the most terrible of vengeances. Ragnar's last voyage ended not in plunder, but in captivity, and his capture would unleash a storm far greater than any he had ever faced at sea. Ragnar Lothbrok's story culminates in one of the most famous and brutal episodes of his legend, his death in the snake pit. Captured by King Ælla of Northumbria, Ragnar was condemned to an execution that, for Christians, would be an act of justice against a ruthless pagan. But for the Vikings, it would become the martyrdom of a hero, the seed of an epic revenge. This was no ordinary end for a warrior leader. It was a spectacle of cruelty that would transform Ragnar's legend into a war cry for his sons. The sagas describe the scene with vivid and grim details. Ragnar was thrown into a deep pit filled with venomous snakes. The torture was slow and agonizing, the snake bites injecting their venom and corroding his body. However, even in the face of this horrific death, legend claims that Ragnar showed no fear. He faced his fate with an almost supernatural serenity, a reflection of his deep belief in predestination, weird, and the promise of Valhalla. Viking honor dictated that death in battle, or faced with courage, was a passport to eternal glory alongside Odin. Ragnar, even on his serpentine deathbed, sought to secure this passage. It was in this final moment that Ragnar, according to the sagas, uttered his most famous and impactful words, a cry of defiance and prophecy that would echo throughout Scandinavia. "It is cause for laughter when a man is dying if the snakes bite him. I shall feast in Valhalla with Odin, and my sons will come to avenge me." This declaration, charged with defiance and acceptance of fate, served multiple purposes. First, it reaffirmed his bravery to his last breath, showing that fear did not conquer him. Second, by invoking Odin and Valhalla, he solidified his image as a true devotee of the Norse gods, ensuring his entry into the Hall of Heroes. But crucially, this prophecy of revenge was the trigger. Ragnar transformed his own death into a weapon. He knew that his sons, heirs to his ambition and pride, could not ignore such an affront. The dishonor of their father would demand retribution of cataclysmic proportions. The prophecy of his son's revenge was not just a wish. It was a cultural imperative. In the Viking world, vengeance was a sacred duty, a matter of family and clan honor. Ragnar's death, as one of the greatest leaders of his era, and the brutal manner in which it occurred, demanded a response that surpassed all others. His sons could not consider themselves men of honor if they allowed their father's death to go unpunished. This vengeance would become the catalyst for one of the greatest events of the Viking Age, the formation of the great heathen army. Ragnar's death by snakes, therefore, was not the end of his story, but the transfiguration of his myth. He became a pagan martyr, a symbol of Viking resistance and indomitability. His death did not weaken his legacy. On the contrary, it cemented it. By surrendering to fate with courage and by invoking the vengeance of his offspring, Ragnar Lothbrok ensured that his name would not be forgotten. He became the reason for terror to spread again through the Anglo-Saxon lands, a motivating force that would drive his sons to commit acts of retribution that would permanently mark the map of England and the course of European history. The snake pit became the altar of his sacrifice, and the serpents, his witnesses. Ragnar Lothbrok's prophecy, uttered on the threshold of his death in a snake pit, reverberated throughout Scandinavia, reaching the ears of his sons and countless warriors who revered the name of the legendary Viking. The news of their father's brutal execution, an unprecedented act of dishonor, not only shocked but unified the most powerful and ambitious among Ragnar's sons, Ivar the Boneless, Bjorn Ironside, Halfdan, Ubba, and Sigurd Snake in the Eye. The pain of loss, and even more so, the stain on family honor, demanded retribution of proportions never before seen. Thus was born the Great Heathen Army, a massive military force that would ravage England like no other before it. This was no ordinary raiding expedition. It was a large-scale revenge campaign, a feud of real dimension. The objective was not merely to plunder, but to conquer, subjugate, and above all, punish King Ælla of Northumbria and all who opposed the Vikings' justice. The formation of this massive force required a level of coordination and leadership that few could achieve. Ragnar's sons, each with their own reputation and their own contingent of warriors, united their banners under a common objective: the destruction of those who dared to defy the Lothbrok lineage. The assembled fleet was impressive, consisting of hundreds of longships and thousands of warriors, perhaps the largest Viking military force ever organized for a single invasion campaign. Sagas speak of an army that seemed endless, capable of dominating not only through combat, but through its sheer scale. This vastness posed an immense logistical challenge, but the promise of vengeance and the prestige of fighting alongside Ragnar's sons were powerful incentives. Men from all over Scandinavia and even from earlier Viking settlements joined the cause, seeing in it not just retribution for a fallen leader, but an opportunity for glory and territorial conquest. The Great Heathen Army landed in East Anglia in 865 AD, catching the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms by surprise with its organization and size. Unlike Ragnar's swift raids, this army intended to stay, to conquer, and to establish itself. They were not just raiders, they were invaders. The army's tactics were an evolution of Ragnar's strategies: mobility, surprise attacks, and the ability to use the disunity among the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms to their advantage. They moved quickly across the country, using rivers to transport their forces and fortifying encampments for the winter. The unity of Ragnar's sons in a common cause was the decisive factor. Ivar the Boneless, with his strategic mind, was the brains behind the campaign, planning movements and battles. Halfdan and Bjorn were the military commanders, leading troops in combat with ferocity. Ragnar's sacrifice, his dishonorable death, became the war cry, the banner under which a vast army united. It was the promise of vengeance that transformed fragmented Viking society into a cohesive and almost unstoppable force, determined to rewrite the destiny of England and forever engrave Ragnar Lothbrok's name in history, even after his death. With the Great Heathen Army firmly established on English soil, the vengeance of Ragnar Lothbrok's sons began to unfold like a storm. Driven by their father's deathbed promise and the sacredness of Viking honor, Ivar the Boneless, Bjorn Ironside, Halfdan, Ubba, and Sigurd Snake in the Eye launched an invasion campaign that would forever change the map of Anglo-Saxon England. The main objective was clear: King Ælla of Northumbria, their father's executioner. The Great Heathen Army's campaign was not a thoughtless attack, but a methodical and devastating invasion. In 866 AD, the army marched on Northumbria. The kingdom was in turmoil due to internal disputes over the throne, a perfect scenario for the Vikings. King Ælla and a rival king, Osbert, briefly united to face the invaders, but their resistance was futile. The battle for York, or Ilfrwich, Northumbria's capital, was decisive. The Vikings, led by Ivar's Cunning, besieged the city and, in a brutal assault, conquered it. King Ælla's defeat and death were as spectacular as Ragnar's own death. According to tradition, Ivar and his brothers captured Ælla alive and subjected him to the Blood Eagle, Blodorn, a notoriously cruel Viking execution ritual where the victim's ribcage was opened from the back and the lungs pulled out, forming the image of wings. Although the historicity of this ritual is debated, the legend of Ælla's execution served as the ultimate revenge and a terrible warning to other Anglo-Saxon kings. Ragnar's prophecy had been fulfilled in the bloodiest way possible. After Northumbria, the Great Heathen Army continued its invasion of England, spreading through other kingdoms. They turned to Mercia and East Anglia, conquering territories, plundering cities and monasteries, and establishing winter camps to consolidate their conquests. The strategy differed from Ragnar's raids. Instead of merely plundering and leaving, they settled, demanded danegeld, and, in many cases, remained to govern the conquered lands. The devastation of the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms was widespread. Many monasteries were destroyed, religious and cultural life was severely impacted, and the political structures of the kingdoms were dismantled. Only the Kingdom of Wessex, under the leadership of the young and resilient Alfred the Great, managed to resist and eventually contain the Viking advance, ensuring the survival of an Anglo-Saxon kingdom in England. The vengeance of Ragnar's sons was not merely an act of retribution. It was a large-scale invasion that transformed England, paving the way for the formation of the Danelaw, a vast area in eastern England where Norse law and culture would prevail for decades. Ragnar's figure, though dead, became more powerful than in life. His death, an act of martyrdom for the pagans, was the link that united a formidable force and unleashed an era of conquests that would redefine the political map of Great Britain, confirming, in every victory and every fire, Ragnar's terrible prophecy fulfilled. The vengeance of Ragnar Lothbrok's sons in England was merely the prelude to a legacy of conquests that would stretch for generations, solidifying Viking influence in vast regions of Europe. Each of Ragnar's heirs, Ivar the Boneless, Bjorn Ironside, Halfdan, Ubba, and Sigurd Snake in the Eye, forged their own path, transforming their father's raids into lasting territorial conquests and shaping the future of Scandinavia and European kingdoms. Ivar the Boneless is often hailed as the most cunning and ruthless of the brothers. After avenging Ælla, he became a dominant figure in Great Britain, commanding the great heathen army. His reputation for cruelty and tactical genius was legendary. Although his ultimate fate is uncertain, sagas associate him with significant conquests in Ireland and the establishment of the Viking Kingdom of Dublin, demonstrating a capacity to govern and consolidate power that went beyond mere plunder. He was a true architect of Viking expansion, more interested in dominion than just spoils. Bjorn Ironside is known for his ambitious expeditions into the Mediterranean, a journey that led him to plunder cities in France, Spain, and even the coast of Italy and North Africa. This vast incursion, which lasted for years, is a testament to his audacity and the advanced capabilities of Viking navigation. He is considered the founder of the Munso dynasty of Jarls, which would later become the lineage of the kings of Sweden. Bjorn not only plundered, but also explored and established trade routes, showing the dual face of Viking expansion, warrior and merchant. Halfdan Ragnarsson, another prominent leader of the great heathen army, is credited with settling in the kingdom of Northumbria and becoming the first Viking king of York. His leadership marked the transition from mere invasion to settlement and governance. He was fundamental in the consolidation of the Danelaw, the vast region of England under Viking rule, where Norse laws and customs were implemented. The founding of lasting kingdoms by Halfdan and his brothers transformed the nature of the Viking presence in Great Britain from a temporary threat to an integral part of the social and political fabric. Ubbi and Sigurd Snake in the Eye also played important roles. Ubbi is often associated with campaigns in East Anglia and other parts of England, while Sigurd is depicted as the founder of a dynasty of kings in Denmark. Their stories, though perhaps less detailed than those of Ivar and Bjorn, complement the image of a family whose ambitions and conquests extended throughout Europe. To follow the destiny of Ivar, Bjorn, Halfdan, and the others is to see how they consolidated Viking power in different regions, shaping the future not only of Scandinavia, but of all Europe. They did not merely continue their father's legacy, but expanded it, transforming raids into kingdoms and plundering into settlements. The Viking presence became a permanent element on the European scene, forcing Christian kingdoms to adapt, to build more robust defenses, and eventually to integrate these invaders into their own societies. The legacy of Ragnar's sons is proof that a leader's influence can transcend their own life, propelling generations to glory and conquest, and leaving an indelible mark on world history. Even after his brutal death in the snake pit, Ragnar Lothbrok's figure did not disappear into obscurity. On the contrary, he ascended to the Viking pantheon of legendary heroes. His life, his deeds, and, crucially, his death, intertwined so deeply with the Norse ideals of bravery, cunning, and the pursuit of glory that he became an archetype, a personification of everything the Vikings admired. Ragnar became more than a man. He became a myth, a role model to be emulated, and a name to be invoked. The manner of his death, accepted with defiance and prophecy, cemented his image as a pagan martyr. For a culture that valued death in combat as the path to Valhalla, Ragnar's resilience in the face of torture, without a cry of pain, only a roar of vengeance, elevated him to the status of one chosen by Odin. His final declaration about the biting snakes and the feast in Valhalla was not just bravado. It was an affirmation of his faith and an invitation to his descendants to perpetuate his legacy. This stoic acceptance of his ultimate fate, so intrinsic to the Norse mindset, made him an example of courage and honor until his last breath. Ragnar embodied Viking ideals in their entirety. His bravery was unquestionable, demonstrated from the slaying of the serpent in his youth to his audacious expeditions in distant lands. His cunning was legendary, seen in the Danegeld strategy in Paris and the ability to manipulate his enemies. The pursuit of glory, fame, was the engine of his life, driving him to feats no one else had dared. He was not just a war leader, he was a navigator, a negotiator, and a strategist who used his mind as much as his sword. The sagas and skaldic poems, transmitted orally for generations and later recorded, were the vehicles that immortalized Ragnar. In them, his deeds are exaggerated and mixed with fantastic elements, but the core of his persona, the fearless adventurer, the father of powerful sons, the man who defied gods and kings, remained. He was the subject of songs in the longhouses, the inspiration for young warriors who dreamed of following in his footsteps, and the name invoked to bring luck in battles. Ragnar's influence on the Viking popular imagination was profound. His story provided a sense of identity and purpose. He was proof that a man, through his own willpower and courage, could ascend to the highest ranks of prestige and leave a legacy that would echo for ages. The success of his sons, who effectively fulfilled his prophecy of vengeance, only reinforced Ragnar's mystical aura, suggesting that he still exerted influence even from the afterlife. Thus, Ragnar Lothbrok did not become a mythical figure by being a unifying king or an empire builder in the traditional sense. He became legendary by personifying the spirit of an era, the Norse desire for adventure, wealth, and immortal glory. His life and death transformed into an epic narrative that continues to fascinate, a reminder that the line between history and legend can be the most potent of all realities, and that in the Viking pantheon, Ragnar's name would shine as intensely as the stars that guided his longships. Ragnar Lothbrok's figure has far transcended historical annals and Norse sagas to become a global icon in contemporary popular culture. Far from being merely an academic subject, Ragnar Lothbrok's name resonates with millions of people worldwide, inspiring a vast array of works in books, films, television series, and games, and solidifying the romantic yet brutal image of the Viking in the collective imagination. The main driving force behind this modern resurrection of Ragnar was the popular television series Vikings, 2013-2020, from the History Channel. Portrayed by Travis Fimmel, the series Ragnar became the face of the Viking Age for a new generation. The production, while taking historical liberties for dramatic purposes, such as condensing multiple characters and events into a single Ragnar and his sons, captured the essence of the Viking spirit. The thirst for exploration, the brutality of war, the complexity of family relationships, and the relentless pursuit of knowledge and glory. The series humanized the Vikings in a way that few previous works had, transforming them from mere barbarians into three-dimensional characters with motivations, passions, and moral dilemmas. The success of Vikings opened the doors for a flood of other productions and cultural references. Historical fiction books about Vikings, which were once a niche, saw an exponential increase in interest. Films, documentaries, and video games like Assassin's Creed Valhalla and God of War which, although inspired by mythology, not directly by Ragnar, benefits from the interest in this universe, explore the Norse universe, often with direct or indirect inspiration from Ragnar's saga and his sons. This proliferation of content solidified Ragnar as the personification of the legendary Viking, the fearless adventurer, the charismatic leader, and the complex family man. Ragnar's influence in popular culture goes beyond entertainment. He helped revitalize interest in Norse history and mythology in general. More people seek to learn about Longships, the gods, Odin, Thor, Freya, the sagas, and the real lives of Vikings. This led to an increase in academic research and a greater understanding of the nuances of this historical era. However, this popularization also brought challenges, as the line between fact and fiction can become even more blurred for the general public, leading to misconceptions about the true history of the Vikings. The figure of Ragnar, with his beard, long hair, tattoos, and armor, has become a visual archetype that is replicated in marketing campaigns, fashion, and even in pop culture events. His image evokes bravery, independence, and a connection to wild nature. He is seen as a symbol of strength and resilience, qualities that resonate with the modern audience. Ultimately, Ragnar Lothbrok's influence on popular culture is a testament to the enduring power of legends and the human capacity to connect with stories of heroes who defy the impossible. The one who lived in the mists of ancient sagas now inhabits the screens of millions, ensuring that his name, even centuries after his death, continues to be uttered with reverence and fascination. He became not only a global icon of the Vikings, but a timeless symbol of adventure and the relentless pursuit of a place in history. When delving into the saga of Ragnar Lothbrok, it becomes inescapable to realize that his story lies on a thin and at times indistinguishable line between historical fact and heroic legend. Unlike figures whose lives are meticulously recorded in annals and contemporary documents, Ragnar is, in large part, a compilation of deeds attributed to various Viking leaders over time, solidified in sagas and skaldic poems that were written centuries after his supposed existence. This ambiguity is, ironically, part of what makes him so fascinating and enduring in popular imagination. The difficulty in separating historical fact from myth in Ragnar's sagas is a constant challenge for historians. The main sources are the sagas of Ragnar Lothbrok, Saxo Grammaticus's Gesta Danorum, and the Anglo-Saxon Chronicles, which mention his sons and the great heathen army but rarely Ragnar directly. While the sagas are rich in details about his life, his marriages, his sons, and his conquests, they also contain fantastic elements, such as fighting giant serpents and dying in a snake pit that seems to have a mythical symbolism, and chronological inconsistencies that make it difficult to perfectly align them with contemporary Christian records. Many historians suggest that the Ragnar Lothbrok of the sagas is, in fact, an amalgam of real historical figures, such as the Danish king Ragnhari, who led the siege of Paris in 845 AD, or other Viking leaders with similar names who operated in England and Ireland. The deeds attributed to him may be the deeds of several strong men from the Viking Age, who were unified into a single heroic narrative to create an iconic character. The purpose of the sagas was not precise historical recording, but the construction of an epic narrative that would inspire, teach values, and celebrate the glory of a people. However, this distinction does not diminish the importance of his legacy, regardless of absolute accuracy. Even if Ragnar Lothbrok was not a single person who accomplished all the deeds attributed to him, the figure of Ragnar represents the essence of the Viking Age. He personifies the audacity of exploration, the brutality of raids, the strategic intelligence, and the insatiable pursuit of fame and land. Ragnar's story and the narrative of his offspring, whose historical deeds are much better attested, such as the great heathen army led by his sons, served as a link between legend and reality. Ragnar Lothbrok's saga reminds us that oral history and myth-building are integral parts of understanding a culture's past. How a people chooses to remember and narrate its heroes says much about its values and aspirations. Ragnar, in this sense, is more than an individual. He is a cultural symbol. He is the embodiment of the ideal Viking, the fearless warrior, the cunning leader, the man who defies fate and inspires his family to greatness. The thin line between history and legend, therefore, is not a weakness, but a strength, allowing Ragnar Lothbrok's figure to continue to inspire and fascinate, serving as a window into the mind and spirit of a remarkable era. He is proof that some truths are more potent when told as legends. Ragnar Lothbrok's saga, whether history or legend, culminates not in a final period, but in the eternity of an indomitable spirit. He was the catalyst and personification of an era that would change the course of European history, leaving a legacy that extends far beyond the sack of Paris or the revenge in Northumbria. Ragnar is not merely a character. He is the Viking spirit in its purest and most intense form, a constant echo of the pursuit of adventure, glory, and a place in collective memory. Ragnar taught us that ambition knows no bounds. His desire to explore the unknown, to go where no other had dared, is at the core of what propelled the Vikings out of their homelands and across the oceans. He wasn't content with what was safe or familiar. He sought what was grand, even if it meant the risk of death. This always more mindset of expanding horizons and challenging limits is one of the most powerful legacies he left. His cunning and adaptability are another pillar of this spirit. Ragnar was not just a warrior of brute force. He was a strategist, a negotiator, and a psychologist. He knew how to use longships to their maximum advantage, exploit his enemies' divisions, and transform warfare into an art form and a source of profit. The Danegeld became a symbol of his ability to extract value, even without immediate permanent territorial conquest, showing that intelligence could be as sharp as a sword. The incessant pursuit of glory, fame, is perhaps the most defining aspect of his spirit. For Ragnar, material wealth was important, but reputation was the true currency. To die with honor, to have his deeds sung by skalds, and to be remembered for generations was the ultimate goal. This quest for immortality through action is what led him to so many risks and, ultimately, to his legendary death, which, paradoxically, only solidified his glory. The lasting impact of Ragnar Lothbrok and the legacy of the Viking Age are undeniable. Viking raids did not merely plunder and destroy. They forced European kingdoms to unite, to build fortifications, and to create naval fleets. They led to the Christianization of Scandinavia and the fusion of cultures in places like Normandy and the Danelaw in England. Norse expansion opened trade routes, connected distant worlds, and ultimately contributed to the formation of medieval Europe as we know it. In essence, Ragnar Lothbrok personifies the human capacity to transcend limitations, to seek a destiny that seems greater than life itself. He represents the courage to face the unknown, the cunning to overcome adversities, and the timeless pursuit of a legacy that echoes through centuries. The Viking spirit he embodied, of adventure, defiance, and reinvention, lives on. The era he inaugurated, and that his sons expanded, was a period of turmoil and transformation, but also of unparalleled vitality and thirst for life. And so, the story of Ragnar Lothbrok, the legendary Viking, is not just a chapter of the past. It is a constant echo in the present, a reminder that the force of will and the courage of a man can, indeed, change the world. The eternity of his raids lies not in the accumulated riches, but in the minds and hearts that, even today, are inspired by his legend, a true testament to his perennial influence.